Good evening. I'm Karen Nelson. I direct the Advanced Architecture Studios, and I'm the acting head of the School of Architecture. Welcome to the third lecture in the spring lecture series of Material Innovations. As many of you are aware, the BAC promotes educational initiatives across the design disciplines of landscape architecture, architecture, and interior design. Tonight, we'll have our minds expanded as we think about landscape architecture and architecture as a contingent and ecologically mindful practice. The work of Susanna C. Drake and her D-Land studio adjusts according to site conditions and programmatic needs. Susanna Drake is the principal of D-Land Studio, an award-winning multidisciplinary design firm that includes landscape architects, urban designers, sculptors, scientists, and architects. Susanna received a Bachelor of Arts degree from Dartmouth College and an MArch and MLA degrees from the Harvard Graduate School of Design. She's the recipient of grants from the Graham Foundation, the James Marston Fitch Foundation, and the New York State Council on the Arts for research on campus landscapes and large-scale urban infrastructure projects. Susanna is the trustee and past president of the New York ASLA, is on the board of the Van Allen Institute, serves on Campus Design Advisory Board at Dartmouth College, and is a former director of the Fine Arts Foundation and a former member of the Directors' Council of New Yorkers for Parks. In addition to her professional practice, she's an adjunct professor of design at the Harvard Graduate School of Design and at City College of New York. She's both a registered landscape architect and a registered architect. The work of D-Land Studio has a sense of connectedness in time and place and scale. There's an elegant playfulness in the Mitten Ice Rink and a clear legibility to the landscapes organization for Abuja, the capital city of Nigeria. Each project is considered through time and through cultural, material, and social systems. The work addresses many issues simultaneously, as you can hear in the title of this lecture, Elastic Landscape, Seeding Ecology in Public Space and Urban Infrastructure. Please extend a warm welcome to Susanna C. Drake.
Well, thank you. That was one of the nicest intros I've ever had. Thank you. I appreciate it. So my talk today, as you said, is called Elastic Landscape, Seeding Ecology in Public Space and Urban Infrastructure. And it will be sort of an overview of some concepts and then focused sort of exploration of 3 projects that we're working on or have worked on in the office. So really, we're looking at how cities that were designed for exchange need to change in their morphology or in the morphology of the edge. Now, given that trade is no longer happening in the same way along that edge. With the move to containerized shipping, the need for storage space and space for gantry cranes and need for transportation, really the idea of having shipping happen in urban centers is no longer really a reality. And so there's actually a potential opportunity for the use of this space that used to be used as this place of exchange of goods. So in New York City, you can see the potential impact that has where, it used to be that this exchange was happening all along the edges of Manhattan and Brooklyn, and now, the shipping ports are actually out in New Jersey, with a little bit still happening within the city limits. So ecological systems exist at a very broad scale in space and time, and the impact of urbanization looks pretty light from this perspective. But when you zoom in to the tighter urban scale, you can see that we've had a tremendous impact on the natural environment. And so my work is actually starting to think about how we might improve these situations. Now, Robert Moses really understood the value of creating green space and had an incredible impact on the city, adding parks and playgrounds and housing. And this slide shows this beautiful network of verdant parkways. But, we all know, or you probably become familiar with this, that the reality was sometimes quite different. But we do have some great examples of systems that combine infrastructure with beautiful unproductive parkland. This is an image of Riverside Park, and it was constructed between 1875 and 1910. It's 191 acres and stretches from 72nd Street to 125th Street along the Hudson River. And it was built to cover the Hudson River rail lines that connected New York City with Albany, which were built in 1846. So it's interesting to look at the shoreline or the historic water, actually really sort of wetland patterns of New York City, and then also start to compare those to some of the flood projection inundation zones that are suggested with sea level rise and climate change issues. One of the things that has happened with this industrial development is that we've created these hardened edges, and we've also created these sewer outfalls from the upland areas. And you can see with some of the sea level rise projections that some of these that some of these sewer outfalls are actually going to be below extreme high tide levels, and that also that this hard edge really can't take or it has to take the full force of a wave that's coming in. So that there's no space for it to dissipate on the edge of the city. So in an ecological condition, you really have a broad expanse of land that can absorb that force and also can absorb the water, right? So the plants are going to absorb it, but then also the angled cross section takes the action out of the wave, right? So that the force isn't going to hit the city as hard. So what we're proposing this is a pretty simple example, but an idea of how we might add passive and active recreation that can absorb some of those forces. Maybe in some places we create places where you can actually get out over the water, but really a sort of thicker edge at that margin. So with that in mind, I want to talk about a couple of projects. This is the Gowanus Canal Sponge Park. We were asked by the Gowanus Canal Conservancy to come up with an open space system around the Gowanus Canal, and it's an old neighborhood, old industrial neighborhood, and we knew that we were backed by the Gowanus Canal the Gowanus Canal Conservancy, and that we were going to be doing lots of community presentations. We needed lots of community buy-in. So we thought, well, how are we going to convince a community group that they should put a lot of swamps in their neighborhood? And we said, or wetlands. And so we thought, well, wetlands act like sponges to absorb the water. So why don't we call it a sponge park? And that idea was born. Now, part of the motivation for doing this is that New York has a combined sewer system. And when there's no rain and dry weather, what happens is that the sewage from domestic and commercial sources actually just goes into the sewage treatment plants. But when you have even a 1/20th of an inch of rain, what happens is that sewage, the sanitary sewage, combines with the stormwater, and you get these overflows into the harbor. And on average, we have about 400 million gallons of this water, this combined effluent, going into the harbor every week. So it's a very big problem. And the Department of Environmental Protection is actually getting fined by the EPA because of Clean Water Act issues in relation to this. So they're actually sort of on the case and doing a lot of work to add these green infrastructure systems to the city. And that work, I think, has happened in part because of some of these projects, mine and work by other landscape architects in the city. So the Gowanus Canal can be a very beautiful water body, as you can see, although this is a baffle to sort of hold back some nasty things. But the edge is somewhat deteriorated, and there's a lot of industrial uses that exist along that edge, and non sort of waterfront dependent uses. So this is the boathouse for the Gowanus dredgers, which is a boating club that uses it as their access, and you can see how badly degraded this area is. And then the other issue is that we have all this stormwater. The streets are impervious, and all this water flows over the streets and collects with it all of this oil and garbage, and all of that ends up in the street ends. And here you can see what's behind the baffle. And you end up with these muddy street ends. So what we did was we sort of took apart the problem. And in an urban setting, there really historically wasn't a lot of thought about the watershed, like the high points, because you just don't think that way because it's not really a natural system. You sort of think of, okay, the water's going to go into the storm drain, and that's the way it works because that's the way cities work. But we thought, well, gosh, let's think about the natural system. So we compared the watershed, the high points, with the sewer shed, and it was sort of interesting to see how they almost correlated, but not quite, because some was jurisdictional and some was natural. And then we looked at the area where we actually could operate, and we calculated the amount of open space that we would need to absorb the surface water runoff for that catchment area. We mapped the location of the sewer outfalls and the storm drains and the direct drainage, and then we presented this notion of this sponge park that would absorb this surface water. And our idea was that we could block the storm drains and take that water and put it to more productive use. So we started to sort of pull apart the problem and analyze it. And so we looked at the hydrology, the ecology, the land use, and the cultural preservation, and looked at how those issues related to maintenance and the ownership and so the contamination, how that leads to poor animal habitat, and really the relationship between the street runoff and the CSOs. And then we also looked at how to manage solid waste and trash, how to start to think about working on some of these contaminants. There are volatile organic compounds within the soil. There's lead, there's cyanide. I mean, there's all this awful. There are many awful things within this soil, in part from the runoff and in part because of all the industrial uses that happened there. There's also really limited public access, and there's some little treasures on the site. There's some great park space, but with limited access or limited connectivity. And then there's also a Revolutionary War monument that no one knows about. So we thought that we could start to actually address some of these issues in the sponge park and improve habitat, add community programming, start to think about how we might preserve some of the historic assets, really instill neighborhood pride, get people to really take care of the neighborhood, and then also use plants and planting strategies and sort of soil strategies that would help to sort of break down and contain some of these toxins. So we looked at some examples of some really smart landscape architects. This designer Kevin Robert Perry's work out in Portland, Oregon. We felt it was really important to show some built projects that we didn't have at the time that were successful. And Portland was such a great model, and as it's turned out, it was a really great model because our new director of sustainability for the city is from Portland, David Bragdon. And we looked at the places where these kinds of strategies could exist. We actually mapped where all the driveways were. We went out and sort of checked the survey to see where the hydrants were and see if there were inconsistencies. Because there's a lot of development that's kind of rogue development. There are fences where there aren't supposed to be fences, and there are places that have been privatized that really aren't supposed to be. So we didn't really want to propose something that was going to get us killed in Gowanus, or thrown into the Gowanus. And then we looked at the potential for this stormwater irrigation esplanade, that there could be a kind of pathway system that existed along that edge. In an average rainfall, basically the filtration swales will take most of the runoff. But when there's a heavier rain, our thought was that we could connect to the storm drains and redirect that water down to the street ends. So we looked at some different models for the remediation, the floating remediation wetlands, sidewalk stormwater filtration swales, street stormwater filtration swales, and remediation wetlands, and thought about where those ideas could be deployed. And then also looked at different plant communities that could exist with different levels of inundation. So actually these can get really dry, because if we have periodic droughts, these would be more upland in the more upland areas. And then these can withstand periodic inundation. And you can see these little indicators of their sort of productive capacity to process PCBs and heavy metals as well. And then also looked at plants that could stay wet all the time, or most, not all the time, but could have wet feet. And then one of the things that was interesting is that the area was undergoing a rezoning at the time. So we went and we presented this diagram to city planning and convinced them that really, a 20-foot setback for all future development setback from the edge of the water wasn't enough, and that they should really think about a 40-foot setback, because look at all the great things that can happen in a 40-foot setback. And we also made the argument that the Gowanus Canal area was historically fairly low industrial, right? And that the idea of that open water and that low profile should continue. And so we actually managed to convince them to have a 40-foot setback from the edge, which was very helpful to us in sort of grabbing more open space. But there are also a number of cases where the buildings go all the way up to the water's edge, and that makes sense because it was a place where goods were exchanged at that water's edge. Those things are no longer happening, but the condition still exists, and the buildings haven't been redeveloped, and we didn't want that to sort of kill the plan. And we also thought it was actually really interesting because what it meant was you could have a promenade, this idea of the urban promenade of a path that at some points is along the water's edge, but sometimes it sort of loops back into the community. So we thought that was actually kind of more interesting. And there were places where we could make these very strong connections to existing open spaces. And we thought that was a really important sort of element as well, because there are some there's some great park space like over here and over here, but they're small. We phased the plan. We looked at places where we could develop sort of first street ends and add street trees in some of these stormwater swales. We also wanted to show places where development was already happening and how our plan might incorporate into those plans. And we met with a lot of the landscape architects and architects that were working on these developments and said, hey, can you think about using this strategy? Because our feeling was this is a master plan. It's not our design, and we're not trying to be proprietary about it at all. We're just saying let's make this area more functional, and here's a sort of outline of opportunities where this kind of work might happen. But then you can see how it sort of it fills out over time, with the ultimate vision being sort of closer to our idea of this urban promenade with these spaces all being connected, and with a more sort of maximized environmental productivity. And here you can see an image of what that would look like in axonometric. Now, in the middle of all of this, the site was declared a Superfund, which was challenging because what that meant was all the development stopped, and we weren't sure if the project was going to go ahead at all, and everything was sort of in question. But what happened for us was we actually made friends with the Superfund people and convinced them that there was a site that was actually okay for us to develop, and we applied for a grant, but I'll talk about that in a little bit. This is an example of how the street ends might be programmed with community gardens, playgrounds, dog runs, neighborhood garden centers. Our idea for the esplanade was that there's a mixture of hardscape and softscape materials. There could be planted edges. Again, these floating remediation wetlands, cafes. The idea of having a canopy close to the water's edge was sort of attractive to us as well. And then a maximizing of views. We wanted to maintain the industrial character of the site, so we were looking at shipping containers, thinking about the material qualities of the industrial area, and then this is the Tate Modern, thinking about how this cable building might become something like that as a cultural space. And then did a series of these section drawings that suggested kind of the overlap of ecologies with program and how those things might use the same spaces in order to sort of enhance that ecological function and the programmatic function, because we do have limited space. How the cafe spaces might relate to the waterfront, how we might sort of shape these profiles, how we might even have these sort of floating spaces or dock access spaces. So here you can see how the planting strategy might work with the midland plants and the upland plants, and then the water-loving plants down along the edge, with the water flowing down to that edge. And then this is a really critical diagram, I think, from an educational perspective, because it teaches you about how hard it is to do work in an urban condition. Not only do you have to engage the community, you have to engage the people who actually regulate all the land. So along with the EPA and the Superfund people, before we even got there, we had to coordinate with the Department of Parks, who controlled the trees and the tree pits, the Department of Transportation, who controls the roadbed, the Department of Environmental Protection controls the CSOs, so the water. So they're going to want to manage all the water that's coming off the road and into the storm drain, and also across with surface flow. The Department of Environmental Conservation, which is a state organization, actually handles the soil because it's a brownfield. So their regulations are ridiculous. Well, they're complicated. But although I'm friends with them, we're friends with everybody. And then the now we are. And then the Army Corps actually handles the sediments that are underneath the canal. So you can see that it's just this incredible sort of tangle of agencies that are involved with these projects. And this is fairly typical. It's a little bit more complicated probably than some. Actually, and one other thing. The DEC controls the shade over the water, which is also just seems like such a crazy thing. You think, oh yeah, I'll just cantilever that walkway to get around those buildings that are along the edge. No, not an option. So here you can see an idea of what the street end might look like. Actually, and this one's interesting too, because we presented this at a community meeting, and the dredgers, who are the boat club, they kind of freaked out because we had a railing here, because we're thinking, okay, we don't want kids to fall in the water, so you put in a railing. And they said, but we can't get out of the water. You know, if a boat comes up, like a bigger boat comes up, we're not going to be able to escape. So we took the railing off, and you can do that in the master plan, and whatever designer does that street end will have to actually, resolve that issue, because it's complicated. So here you can see a view looking south. That's that industrial building that I talked about as a potential cultural facility, and this wetland in one of the turning basins, and the esplanade. And then a view looking north. This is downtown Brooklyn from 3rd Street. And then one of our major backers of the project was Nydia Velasquez. She's our congresswoman, and she appropriated money through the EPA. And she had never been able to get an interiors appropriation, because interiors through the EPA. But because this actually indirectly managed sewage, she managed to get money to the site. But her husband apparently proposed to her along the Gowanus Canal, so we did this rendering in her honor. So as I mentioned before, we got a grant from the New England Water Pollution Control Commission to actually do the first prototype. So that slide that I showed you of the dredger's boathouse, that's right here in one of those shipping containers, and this is that kind of that sort of nasty edge. And so we're basically looking at these two blocks. And there's some Parks Department green streets, and so what we're going to do is take those over and start to make them more productive. We're trying to make it a modular system so that it can be used in other places around the canal and around the city. And you can see how that would work. This is really in design development at this point, although it's going to have to go into really rapid design development because we're supposed to be in construction in the fall. But here you can see the unitized system. And what that would look like. So that is the Gowanus Canal Sponge Park. And now I'm going to talk to you about some of our other infrastructure work. This project is called the BQ Green Reconnection Strategies for Brownstone, Brooklyn. And when I started my practice, I really wanted to do large-scale infrastructure projects and campus planning, and I thought, well, nobody's going to hire me to do that without a track record. And I guess a lot of people will take the work that they did from other firms and say, well, I was the project leader on that. And I thought, well, okay, I could do that, but it's a team, and how do you really define your role? And so I thought, well, I'm just going to apply for some grants. And I applied for the grants that you mentioned. And the first one that I got was actually from NISCA to explore this site. And I want to read this. This is a historical rendering of the BQE as it was proposed. And he, Robert Moses, spent a lot of time looking down at it, watching the cranes and derricks and earth-moving machines that looked like toys far below him, moving about in the giant trench being cut mile after mile mile after mile of densely packed houses, a big black figure against the sunset in the late afternoon, like a giant gazing down at the giant road he was molding. Now, he had an apartment that actually looked down on this site. So, this is actually the vision, or this is, was the realization of that vision. It's not quite the Verdant Parkway that he had proposed. But his apartment was actually down here, and he was looking down here at this, which all the pink, the pink areas here are buildings that were demolished in the construction. So we looked at some of the social issues, the relationship of the trench to asthma rates and physical obesity, or physical activity and obesity and poverty, just to see if there were correlations. And then also looked at some of the physical issues in relation to the trench, these raised highways, the fences, and just the general conditions. There's some interesting adjacencies. A lot of the extra space is actually used for open space, and some of it's very actively used. My son played Little League down here. There's a handball court here and lots of playgrounds, although you have to think about the wisdom of putting a playground next to a highway. But that's something we're trying to address through these projects. So if you look at the existing neighborhoods, in Cobble Hill, you have multi-million-dollar houses on one side of the trench, and then less than multi-million-dollar properties on the other side. The real estate values here are much lower than over here. It's interesting how the trench can actually also cause these sort of territorial boundaries. We're working on a site in Williamsburg now where you have the Latino community, where it's a Latino community generally, but you have the Puerto Rican community on one side and the Dominican community on the other side, and there's like these, there's this clash, and there's very clear sort of territorial boundaries of the gangs on either side. So we're actually looking at if we are able to do some strategies to bring the sides together, we're hoping to, at least address that a little bit, but we'll see what happens. So we looked at some of the open space issues in relation to the Plan YC, which is the mayor's new guidelines for open space. This is a 10-minute walk from the closest park, and you can see how there's kind of this space here that really isn't served for any kind of park space. Now, our Williamsburg site is served for park space, but there isn't a whole lot of active recreation space, and that's the space that would be used by the middle school kids, who would be the kids who are more susceptible to getting involved in the gangs. So in working with the community, it's helpful to have some sort of device for recording decision-making along the way. So we came up with the idea of this productive matrix with environmental benefits and recreation, vehicular circulation, health and safety, pedestrian circulation, and development, and looked at how, when you're doing any project in a city, there's sort of you can't say there's direct competition for these issues, but all of these issues, have a kind of weight in your decision making, and different groups are going to have clearly different views on maximizing any one of these things. And when with the BQE, the maximized factor was only the car, and so we thought, well, that's a problem, and that's something that we can work on. So we also wanted to break it down and think about the existing conditions, like the sort of structure of this infrastructural barrier, and what the sort of functions were of the structure, the second roadways, and the highway, and then think about how we might add additional layers, either permeable paving, bike lanes, planting beds, the green wall systems, or just additional open space, and how that might occur sectionally in different options. So this diagram is actually another really important one, and you can see we rely heavily on diagrams. Diagrams are your friend. We use some U.S. Forest Service data to basically calculate the value of our open space strategies. And this drawing actually helped to secure a local match from federal money that was coming in to do work on this project. So, but we calculated that we could generate $250,000 worth of oxygen, $500,000 close to $500,000 of pollution control, recycle almost $300,000 worth of water, and contribute $4 million in shade value for a 10-year gain of almost $50 million. So that's a benefit to the city. It's a benefit to our community, but it's not something that any one person gets. But the city is starting to think more about the value of some of these broader ecological issues. So the other thing that's sort of interesting is that the city had put a lot of energy into this site with these federal monies. But if you look at and probably because it was a really good development area, but if you look at the median household income here, it's $80,000 with a population of 104,000. Our northern site in Williamsburg has a population of 160,000 and a median income of half as much. But our cost here, we're only doing a couple blocks, is only $100 million versus we estimated it would be about $1 billion to do full capping of the other trench project. So this is the BQ Green in Williamsburg, and this is the cross section of the street. It varies from block to block, and that's a really important thing because the highway, the clearance of the trucks, it wasn't designed for federal highway standards, and so we can't make the deck very thick. And so we needed to have we needed to have it so that the structure could touch down in the middle. So we determined that there were 3 blocks where it was actually feasible to do the span with a thin deck, and then there was 1 block where it just really wasn't going to be cost effective to do that. So that affected how we planned the project. So we looked at capping these 2 blocks. So adding basically. Actually, we started with it's a phased plan. So we started with our option 1, which was basically improving the edges, and then looked at the capping of the 2 blocks in the middle, because any project in New York City is going to take 20 or 30 years, project of this scale anyway. So with the capped version, we were able to add a baseball field and a soccer pitch. And then in our third sort of stage, we added also a community center. So you can see the before and then the after. You can barely tell where you are anymore. And then here, this passively used seating area, you can see it's very passive. There's no one there. That would turn into a barbecue area for the community with the soccer field in the background. And then this minimally used handball court would become this recreation center, really a place that could be used more actively by the community. In Cobble Hill, this is the existing condition. Here we went back to this wheel strategy, and this is the existing condition. If we look at adding a green wall to this, you can see that the phase 1 strategy, this is the before and the after. Here, the wheel this is the original or the existing condition. You can see the wheel is starting to fill out. In this case, we're adding more of the street trees, and this is our $50 million gain by just adding the street trees and the green wall. Actually, just adding the street trees will do it. And this is what that would potentially look like if the trees are on steroids in a Photoshop world. And then here in this third condition with the decking, you can see that the wheel starts to fill out. And, the traffic is similar to what it was, but it's a healthier environment and it's better for people, and the development zones can increase as well. One of the notions that I had was that that you could have this kind of modified Jane Jacobs where, you keep the existing low-rise character in most places, but just upzone the corners. So it's kind of this, Jane and Robert kind of duking it out a little bit. So here's the before and then the after. This site actually exists adjacent to Brooklyn Bridge Park, so it could become this really sort of fluid a whole network for the area leading down to Red Hook. So, and then this final project that I'm going to talk about, some of you may have visited the MoMA exhibit last year. but it's Lower Manhattan, a new urban ground. We were asked to participate in basically a design charrette by the Museum of Modern Art, and this is our model of our site. The project examined the impacts of climate change and sea level rise in New York Harbor. And 5 design teams were selected to develop work in studios out at PS1. Matthew Baird, Scape, and Architects, and the Aero D-Land studio team were all selected. And really what this map is showing is that with rapid ice cap melt, scientists project a 6-foot sea level rise in the next 100 years. So Manhattan is an island, and it's something that we often forget. But it had a very different shape when it was originally settled. This is the edge morphology in 1650. And you can see how that was a very different condition when the first boats came in. You know, it was probably more like that soft edge section that I showed at the beginning of the lecture. But you can see that by 1850, these hard edges began to emerge with these slips to facilitate trade. And then by 1960, you ended up with these finger piers sticking out from that hardened bulkhead. So that same bulkhead is back here, but the slips all got filled in as well. So the thing to notice here, too, is that the alignment of there's an alignment of the mercantile edge with the internal street edge, which, you know, kind of goes away with this disconnected morphology of 2010 with this recreational edge. So we've created a very different kind of system than what was originally there or what was historically there for shipping. But you can see that this line is pretty interesting because this line is pretty much that 1650 line, and that we've created all this fill space that will potentially be constantly underwater, the darker blue, and then periodically flooded if we have a Category 2 storm surge. So we also have this condition of the combined sewer overflows that I mentioned before, and these are the location of those outflows. So those will all be underwater. So what we were trying to do is create a system where we're thinking about how to manage the fresh water, the CSO waters, you know, they're coming from the sky, the storm water, and then also how we manage the salt water coming from the ocean or from the bay. And again, you know, it's a complicated system where there's lots of different jurisdictions that have to be managed. So we really looked at a 2-part system. There's an upland sponge streets and the soft green edge. The edge system of public parks and freshwater wetlands and salt marshes. So within the island, the city streets offer an opportunity for new ecological infrastructure. The streets are redesigned for absorption, distribution, collection, and protection. We designed this system of waterproof vaults. Basically, we took all the utilities out of the street and stuck them under the sidewalks with the idea that if you put them in vaults that could be accessed, you could then replace them as they became obsolete, and you wouldn't constantly be digging up the streets. And then you take all that street space and you actually make it absorbent so that it can take the surface water runoff. And we designed these different kinds of streets. So some of them were taking regular surface water runoff, and some of them were taking sort of bigger flows from these flood conditions. So this is one of the streets that would be a collector street that would take a lot of that water. And here we're imagining sort of new kinds of infrastructure systems that could work with this idea. We made a new hardened edge that was at a higher level, and then outbound from that created this new waterfront park space. We have these freshwater wetland spaces. And then saltwater wetlands. Now, it's not just green poché. Like, basically, we calculated all of the rainwater inputs that were coming into the system and then figured out how much open space we needed to absorb that water. So we have, I think, something like 450 acres of space, and we needed 80 acres of permeable ground in order to absorb the surface water runoff. So there's like a rigor behind these fuzzy green edges. And this is the plan. So you can see how these edge conditions actually relate to these upland streets. and I'm going to go through some of the particular conditions walking around Manhattan, and then we'll break for questions, because I know we want to leave time for that. So here, looking at the urban estuary at Northmore Street, you can see the combination of the upland wetland and the recreational space and the saltwater marshes. And it's interesting because at Battery Park City, the bathymetry, that's the underwater topography, drops off really steeply. So we really had to cut back into Battery Park City rather than building out further with these wetlands. So here you can see the condition, again, at Battery Park City, the urban estuary at Liberty Street. Here we actually allowed the water to run through the city, so you'd have these different kinds of experiences of how nature and the urban condition can interact more productively. And here we had the Battery Breakwater. We were thinking of using some of the dredge material that's taken out of the harbor yearly or continually, pretty much, and putting it into these geotextile sacks that could form islands. These would all morph over time. Like right now, they're pretty rectilinear, but with tides and with deposition patterns, they're going to turn into something very different, and it'll become this whole sort of landscape of shallows that you could kayak through. And then over on the east side, our idea was there the bathymetry is much more gentle, and we had the idea of having these pathways through the wetland spaces. And then we also designed this thing we called an urban Esker at Fulton Street. And Esker is a geologic formation it's a deposition of a long sort of snake-like mound that was formed when the glaciers receded. And so our idea was that this mound, this urban Esker, and actually it's funny because I think in Esker also means pathway in Gaelic. So it's like all these sort of wonderful layering of meanings as well. On the upland side of the Esker, we also had a sunken forest, and that was inspired by the landscapes of Fire Island, where the trees grow up to the top of the dunes, and because that's where the salt spray is affecting them. So our idea was to look at these ecological conditions and think of them as inspiration. So here we have one of the sponge slips that actually feeds into that sunken forest, and this is a sassafras tree which can withstand the salt inundation. So, and then there you have it. This is our plan of Lower Manhattan. We really wanted to create a vision where there was just a completely new way of thinking about how the environment can interact with the urban condition. And I guess with that, I'll open it up for questions. Thank you. I think in terms of the inputs to the system, it's not based on like people producing more effluent. It's really it's based on sort of climate projections. So the idea is that there's a certain amount of rainfall projected in 50 years or 100 years, and we. Okay. And so we're using that data. I mean, I think it's a really good question because obviously, we're going to have to adapt. With this plan, we were anticipating that the city's going to add 1 million people. So that's why we have all these sort of ghosted buildings. Our idea was that development could continue up the west side of Manhattan and that it would occur in this same kind of crenellated pattern. But that it had to be a different kind of morphology than it is now. It could no longer be the sort of filled-in finger piers. It would have to have these places where that energy and that water, frankly, could be dissipated within the